And in Newark, New Jersey, 1,000 students walked out of class on Tuesday protesting Governor Chris Christie's budget cuts to the state's educational funding of public schools. Now, this walkout is in response to a number of complaints, mainly that the public schools, like most around the U.S., are understaffed with cuts to programs, classrooms, and all of them are in major need of repair. Now, this is very similar to other protests we've seen, like cities in Chicago, and earlier this month with over 54 school closures following a budget deficit. Now, here to discuss this is RT correspondent Anastasia Churkina, who's on the ground in Chicago and joins us now from the New York studio. So what's happening in Newark?
Well, Margaret, what we saw happen earlier this week on Tuesday, according to different estimates, from several hundred up to 2,000 public high school students walked out of their schools, about a dozen schools in total, to protest what seems to be becoming a trend in the United States, budget cuts to public education. And this comes after the announcement that Governor Chris Christie is considering cutting an entire $56 million out of the public school funding, and this is exactly what the students organized by the Newark Students Union were protesting. They were saying this was far from the first time that these budget cuts are taking place when it comes to the schools, that it's highly avoidable, that officials could have gone in other directions to not have these budget cuts take place. Also, they're saying that it's the neighborhoods with minorities primarily being targeted, and that they're going to keep coming out onto the streets to protest this.
I see. So you mentioned Governor Christie's budget cuts in education in 2010, and that was actually ruled unconstitutional by the New Jersey Supreme Court. And there was a promise made to put that money back, and so far he hasn't. Is there anything going on that's going to make him return those funds, or was this just some symbolic gesture by the court? Can they actually make him put the money back?
Well, Margaret, you know, I think considering this court decision was ruled 3 years ago, we're in 2013 now, it seems highly unlikely that this money is going to be returned into the system. Like you mentioned, at that point in 2010, what happened was he put in place a budget cut of almost $1 billion, to be exact, over $800 million, and this has still not been put back regardless of that decision. And so, of course, it's been highly symbolic. But, you know, it's worth noting that since Christie took office in 2010, a total of $3.6 billion in budget cuts to schooling have taken place. And meanwhile, people are just completely outraged by this on the ground, that he put in place a total of $2.1 billion in tax breaks for big business.
I want to take you back. So you were in Chicago covering, you know, these 50 school closures there in that school system. And here's what, in these times, Jacobin reporter Micah Utrecht had to say about these closures.
Of those 75 closings that have happened in the past, 40% of those closed buildings are now privately operated, most of which are done by charter. So it seems like this round of closings, along with closings that have happened in the past, are just a way to sort of backdoor privatization to allow charter schools to expand in the city.
So, Anastasia, you know, these protests that are happening in Chicago and in Newark on the ground, do you think that they're actually going to make a difference?
Well, good question, Margaret. I mean, people are hoping that the fact that they're coming out is certainly going to attract attention to these issues, because if they don't come out, then, you know, the officials are going to assume that the people are absolutely fine with these decisions, which they're certainly not, as we saw this week in Newark and last month in Chicago.
I see. So certainly a lot happening in terms of public education here. What's next? What's next for these guys?
Well, you know, Margaret, what we're hearing is promises to continue coming out onto the streets. I mean, in Chicago, the final vote will not take place on the closing of the 54 public schools until the end of May, and the schools will remain until August. So people are hoping that more protests will bring the message home to the officials, and that these decisions will not take place. But, you know, officials, obviously, the way they are reacting or not reacting to these protesters in Newark and in Chicago, it seems unlikely that they're going to withdraw from these decisions.
I see. Well, Anastasia, certainly a lot happening on the ground. That was RT's Anastasia Churkina in New York.